The first time I realized somebody from that fancy neighborhood behind my property had completely lost touch with reality was the morning I found an entire patio set buried in my woods. Not a chair, not a cushion, an entire patio set. I remember standing there with a coffee mug in one hand, staring at a rusted metal table upside down in the brush, surrounded by broken planters, rotting bags of mulch, and enough grass clippings to start a small farm. For a second, I honestly thought somebody had dumped it by mistake. Then I noticed the tire tracks. Fresh tracks. They cut straight through the edge of my property, like whoever drove them didn't even consider the possibility that the land belonged to an actual person. That was the moment I knew this wasn't an accident. Now, my name's Garrett Cole, and I live outside a subdivision called Cedar Ridge Estates, about 40 minutes east of Knoxville. At least that's what the sign says when you drive past the giant stone entrance with a fake waterfall and decorative lanterns that probably cost more than my pickup truck. My place sits right behind it. Or technically, my place was there first. My grandfather bought the property back in 1974 when nobody wanted land this far from town. 10 acres of woods, a small cabin-style house, a creek running through the backside, and enough privacy to forget the rest of the world existed. When I inherited it, I never had any plans to sell. People asked all the time. Developers asked. Realtors asked. One guy offered me what he called a life-changing amount of money. I told him my life was already fine. That usually ended the conversation. The truth is, after my divorce, quiet became important to me. I spent almost 20 years working commercial construction. Most days were filled with noise, arguments, deadlines, concrete dust, and somebody yelling because something cost more than expected. By the time I hit my 40s, peace felt more valuable than money. Cedar Ridge didn't really understand that. Most of the people living there weren't bad people exactly. They were just different. Every lawn looked identical. Every mailbox matched. Every flower bed looked like it had been inspected by the military. Some folks spent more time worrying about curb appeal than they did talking to their neighbors. I mostly kept to myself. For years, that arrangement worked. Then the dumping started. At first, it was small stuff. A bag of leaves here. A pile of branches there. Nothing major. I figured landscapers got lazy. Maybe they crossed the line accidentally. Then the piles got bigger. Much bigger. One Saturday morning, I decided to check the trail cameras I kept near the south edge of my property. I originally installed them because raccoons kept getting into my chicken feed. What I found instead made my stomach drop. The camera footage showed 3 landscaping trucks entering through a maintenance access road behind Cedar Ridge. Not once. Not twice. Over and over. Different days. Different crews. Same destination. My land. One video showed a worker actually pointing toward my no trespassing sign before backing the truck up and dumping debris over the fence anyway. Then everybody laughed. That laugh bothered me more than the dumping, because it told me they weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they believed nobody was going to stop them. That afternoon, I printed screenshots from the footage, climbed into my truck, and drove straight toward the Cedar Ridge HOA office. At the time, I thought I was about to solve a problem. I had no idea I was actually walking into the beginning of a war that would eventually tear that entire neighborhood apart from the inside. The HOA office sat right next to the community clubhouse, a massive stone building with white columns out front and enough polished glass to blind you on a sunny day. The whole place looked less like a neighborhood office and more like a country club that accidentally became a government agency. I parked my truck, grabbed the folder of screenshots, and walked inside. That's where I met Valerie Whitmore. Now, every neighborhood has that one person who somehow ends up running everything. In Cedar Ridge, that person was Valerie. Mid-50s, always dressed perfectly, always smiling, always speaking in that calm, professional tone that somehow made every sentence sound like a warning. She greeted me with a smile. "Mr. Cole, what can we help you with today?" I set the screenshots on her desk. The smile faded slightly. She flipped through the pages, looked at the pictures, then leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said carefully, "the property boundaries back there have always been somewhat complicated." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. "Complicated?" I said. "My grandfather's survey markers were there, before your subdivision existed. She folded her hands together. Our contractors may have assumed the area wasn't actively maintained. That sentence stuck with me. Not actively maintained. Like because I didn't manicure every square inch of woodland, it somehow became public property. Like trees only mattered if somebody landscaped them. I told her exactly what I expected. 7 days. Remove every piece of debris. Clean up the damage. And we could forget the whole thing ever happened. She nodded politely. Promised she would look into it. Promised somebody would contact me. Promised a lot of things. Then I noticed something. She wasn't worried. Not even a little. The expression on her face looked almost amused. Like she had dealt with people like me before. People who complained. People who got ignored. People who eventually gave up. That should have been my warning sign. A week passed. Nothing happened. No phone call. No cleanup crew. No apology. Actually, things got worse. When I checked the fence line again, the pile had grown. Fresh hedge trimmings. Broken pavers. Construction scraps. Somebody had added more junk after my meeting with Valerie. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Because now it wasn't negligence anymore. It was disrespect. And maybe that sounds dramatic, but when you spend your entire life taking care of something, watching people treat it like garbage hits differently. That land wasn't just dirt. It was memories. My grandfather teaching me how to fish in the creek. My father helping me rebuild sections of the barn. Long nights after my divorce, sitting on the porch listening to nothing except frogs and wind. Every acre meant something, and these people treated it like a dumpster. A few days later, my neighbor Hank rolled over on his ATV while I was repairing a fence post. Hank was a retired electrician, former Marine, and probably the most stubborn human being I'd ever met. He looked at the debris pile, looked at me, then shook his head. You gonna let that slide? Simple question, but it landed hard, because I already knew the answer. No, I wasn't. That evening I sat on my porch watching the sun disappear behind the tree line. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet you can't buy anymore. I thought about the HOA, about Valerie, about that smile, about the way she dismissed everything. And somewhere around midnight, I stopped being angry. That's usually when people become dangerous. Not when they're furious. When they're calm. The next morning, I rented an industrial wood chipper. The guy behind the rental counter asked what project I was working on. I told him landscaping. Technically, it wasn't a lie. For the next 2 days, I worked nonstop. Every branch, every leaf, every pile of grass, every piece of organic debris they dumped. I shredded all of it. The compost pile grew bigger and bigger. By the end, I had mountains of rich, dark material. And then I started adding things. Wildflower seed, native ground cover, fuss spreading vines, clover mixes. Nothing illegal, nothing toxic, nothing harmful. Just plants. Lots of plants. Now, before anyone gets the wrong idea, I wasn't trying to destroy anybody's property. I stayed entirely on my side of the survey line. I checked the markers twice. Actually, 3 times. What I wanted was simple. Privacy. If the people of Cedar Ridge couldn't respect boundaries, maybe nature could create some. Saturday morning, I climbed onto my tractor and started spreading compost along the fence line. A thick band running almost the entire southern edge of my property. By lunchtime, I noticed people watching. A couple stood on a deck, pretending not to stare. A man walking his dog slowed down and stood there for almost 5 minutes. One woman actually took pictures. Around sunset, a jogger approached the fence. "What are you planting?" he shouted. I looked up from the tractor. Privacy. He laughed because he thought I was joking. I wasn't. The first week, nothing happened. Then came the rain. Warm spring rain, followed by several days of humid weather. Perfect growing conditions. Tiny green shoots appeared everywhere. At first, they seemed harmless. A little extra greenery near the fence. No big deal. By the second week, things changed. The vines started climbing. The ground cover exploded. Wildflowers appeared in clusters. Everything grew faster than expected. One morning, I woke up to 3 voicemails. By afternoon, there were 8. By evening, there were 12. Most came from unknown numbers. One woman sounded panicked. There are weeds coming through the retaining wall. Another caller sounded furious. Whatever you're growing is spreading onto private property. I nearly laughed listening to that message. Private property. Interesting concept. Valerie called the next morning. No cheerful tone this time. No customer service voice. Just pure frustration. What exactly did you do? I leaned back in my porch chair and watched a pair of deer crossing near the creek. I improved my soil. Don't play games with me. I'm not. Residents are complaining. I took a sip of coffee. Residents complained when they got caught dumping too. Silence. The kind of silence where somebody is trying very hard not to say what they're really thinking. Finally, she spoke. You knew this would happen. No, I said. I knew plants grow. That conversation ended quickly. The weeks that followed were something else entirely. Landscaping crews appeared almost daily. Homeowners argued near property lines. Sprayers came out. Weed trimmers came out. Entire sections of decorative landscaping got ripped up and replaced. And the funniest part? The same landscaping company that dumped debris on my property was now getting paid thousands of dollars to fight vegetation along the fence. I recognized their trucks immediately. One afternoon, I watched them from a trail camera feed, while homeowners stood nearby, pointing fingers and arguing. The whole thing should have ended there. If Cedar Ridge had admitted they made a mistake, if Valerie had apologized, if somebody had simply cleaned up the mess from the beginning, none of what came next would have happened. Instead, 3 weeks later, I opened my mailbox and found a certified letter from an attorney. 12 pages, single-spaced, threatening legal action, accusing me of intentionally causing environmental damage and reducing neighboring property values. I sat at my kitchen table reading it twice because I genuinely couldn't believe what I was seeing. They dumped construction waste onto my property, then hired a lawyer because plants grew near their fence. That was the exact moment the situation stopped being a neighborhood dispute. Because if they wanted lawyers involved, fine. But I wasn't going to start with a lawyer. I was going to start with something much worse. A county inspector. And once that idea entered my head, I had a feeling somebody in Cedar Ridge was about to have a very bad month. The county inspector's name was Raymond Pierce. And the first thing I noticed about him was that he looked completely unimpressed by everything. He drove an old pickup with mud on the wheel wells, wore work boots that had clearly seen better days, and carried himself like a man who had spent decades dealing with people trying to explain why rules shouldn't apply to them. I liked him immediately. 3 days after I filed a complaint, Raymond pulled into my driveway just after sunrise. We walked the fence line together while I explained everything from the beginning. He took photos of the debris pile, measured distances to the creek, collected samples of the remaining construction material, and barely said a word. Then I showed him the footage. We sat at my kitchen table watching truck after truck back up to my property. Workers unloading debris, branches, mulch, drywall, construction scraps. At one point, a worker pointed directly at the no trespassing sign. Everybody laughed. Then they dumped anyway. Raymond paused the video. Leaning back in his chair, he rubbed his forehead and sighed. Well, he said, that was stupid. It was the first real reaction he'd shown all morning. Then he watched the rest. When the final truck disappeared from the screen, he closed the laptop and looked at me. How official do you want this? I didn't even need a second to think. Very. He nodded once. That was all. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Apparently, when construction debris gets dumped near drainage areas, county agencies become extremely interested, especially when documentation already exists. And thanks to the security footage, timestamps, photographs, and survey maps, there wasn't much room for debate. 10 days later, the first notices started arriving. The landscaping company got hit first, then several homeowners, then Cedar Ridge itself. That's when everything exploded. See, during the investigation, county officials uncovered something nobody expected. Emails. Months of emails. Residents had apparently complained before. Not about me. About the landscapers. Multiple homeowners had reported seeing crews dumping waste behind the subdivision long before my footage existed. Meaning somebody on the HOA board either knew it was happening or ignored enough warnings that they should have known. Either way, the county wasn't interested in excuses. The fines piled up quickly. Cleanup costs, environmental assessments, violation penalties, contractor citations. By the time everything was calculated, the total damage approached $80,000. And suddenly the neighborhood that spent years acting like the center of the universe discovered consequences. A week later, Hank called me laughing so hard he could barely get words out. "You need to drive by the entrance." So I did. And good Lord, it looked like a political uprising. Residents stood in clusters arguing near the clubhouse. Board members got cornered in the parking lot. Landscapers worked overtime trying to repair damaged sections of common areas. At one point, I heard a man in golf clothes yelling loud enough for half the county to hear. I pay nearly $1,000 a month, and nobody knew this was happening. Another woman was screaming at someone about legal fees. Someone else blamed the board. The board blamed contractors. The contractors blamed miscommunication. Everybody blamed everybody. Nobody wanted responsibility. Funny how that works. For years, they had all enjoyed the benefits of somebody else looking the other way. The second consequences showed up, nobody wanted ownership. Over the following weeks, Cedar Ridge became the biggest source of gossip in 3 counties. People talked about it at gas stations, hardware stores, church parking lots. The story spread everywhere, and every version got a little bigger than the last. Some people thought I was a hero. Others thought I was petty. A few probably thought I was insane. Honestly, maybe all 3 were true. Then something happened that I never expected. About 6 weeks after the fines were issued, Valerie showed up at my house alone. No luxury SUV en toraje. No board members. No lawyer. Just Valerie. She parked near the barn and walked toward the porch. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked tired. Really tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like somebody had been carrying a weight for years and finally got too exhausted to hold it anymore. I was stacking firewood when she approached. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. Then she looked toward the woods. "I think we handled this badly." I laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. "You think?" A faint smile appeared on her face. The first genuine smile I'd ever seen from her. Not polished. Not rehearsed. Just human. I deserve that. That caught me off guard. Because honestly, I had expected another argument, another excuse, another speech. Instead, she sat down on the porch steps. For the next 20 minutes, we talked more honestly than we ever had before. Turns out she hadn't grown up wealthy. Far from it. Her father worked maintenance for county parks. Her family spent years living paycheck to paycheck. Moving into Cedar Ridge had been a symbol of success for her. Proof she'd made it. And somewhere along the way, she'd become so focused on protecting her place within that world that she'd stopped questioning the people around her. Stopped noticing when bad behavior became normal. Stopped challenging things she should have challenged. I listened. Didn't excuse anything. But I listened. Because people are complicated. Villains rarely wake up planning to become villains. Most just make small compromises over and over until one day they don't recognize themselves anymore. Eventually, she stood up, looked toward the fence line where thick vegetation now created a natural barrier between my property and the subdivision. The view was completely different. You could barely see Cedar Ridge anymore. Just trees, wildflowers, greenery, nature reclaiming space. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. I looked out across the woods. The truth was I felt peaceful, not victorious, not angry, just peaceful. The dumping had stopped. The county handled the violations. The barrier provided more privacy than any fence ever could. And life had finally become quiet again. So I gave her the only answer that felt right. "I think everybody should stay on their own side of the property line." She nodded. No argument. No comeback. A few seconds later, she walked back to her vehicle and drove away. That was the last conversation we ever had. These days, when I sit on my porch in the evening, I mostly see trees. The wildflowers came back stronger than ever. Birds nest along the fence line. Deer move through the woods almost every morning. And the neighborhood behind me stays exactly where it belongs. On the other side. Now, every time I tell this story, people split into 2 groups. One group says I should have hired a lawyer immediately and avoided all the drama. The other group thinks Cedar Ridge got exactly what it deserved. Honestly, I can see both arguments. Maybe I could have handled things differently. Maybe they could have too. But here's one thing I know for certain. Nobody has dumped so much as a single leaf onto my property ever again. And sometimes that's all the proof you need that a lesson was finally learned. So now I want to hear from you. Did I take things too far? Did the HOA deserve every bit of what happened? Or should both sides have handled the situation differently before it spiraled out of control? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this are never as simple as right versus wrong. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for more real stories where pride, property, and consequences have a funny way of colliding when people forget where the boundary line really is.